wants to use them. So we need this so that it can tell us in context what is the human behavior that was going on at that particular site at any particular time. And then we report that. It's ethically, we're required to report our findings. And why is that? Because science builds upon older science. So what we put out there, other researchers in other areas can pick up and look at, what we found at our site and compare it to what they found at theirs. And because of that, we've been able to find some really large regional patterns. So for instance, in the picture on the left of the United States, you can see that this particular place in Ohio, it's near Chillicothe, Ohio, have all of these materials that come from all over the U.S. and some even from Mexico, probably. We have obsidian that's coming out of the West. We have chert that's coming out of the Midwest. We have mica from the Atlantic coast, marine shell from the Gulf of Mexico. So all of these items are being traded along these routes, and they're all converging in this one particular area. So we can learn a lot just from having studies from these other areas to trace maybe what these transportation routes looked like and who was involved in them, who participated in them. So now I'm going to turn it over to Bill Stanton, and he's going to give you the culture history of Florida.
All right, thanks, Paulette. Give me just a second. I get my PowerPoint ready to be seen. Okay, Paulette, can you see my screen?
I can.
Okay, great.
You want to switch your display settings.
Okay, got it. All right. Yeah. Oh, yeah, that thing that happened yesterday is happening again. It'll be just a second. Yeah, this happened yesterday. For some reason, my cursor freezes up and it takes just a second for it to catch up. Okay. Now I can't see my cursor at all. Oh, there we go. Okay, how's that?
Looks good.
Michael, does that look okay now?
Yes.
All right, great. Sorry about the delay. Technology is our friend. All right. Again, hi, I'm Bill Stanton. I'm the Cultural Resources Section Supervisor in the central office at the Florida Park Service. I'm going to be talking about culture history, and the way I usually do this in the ARM training is I present it as an overview of the prehistory of whatever region of the state we were presenting in. We were doing we had a show on the road. I'm just going to use the Northwest Florida regional version as an example. And so the first thing I wanted to say is that when you're talking about culture history or the development of culture over time, what we like to say is culture history is not teleological. which means that the teleological argument was developed by European philosophers and theologians a couple hundred years ago, and that was based on the idea that all cultures progress over time from a lower state to a higher state, and that the European societies at the time who came up with the argument determined that they were the pinnacle of advanced civilizations, and that all of the cultures were somehow inferior, or they were working their way up towards a higher state. And what we come to understand, and more recently, is that cultures and societies change, adapt, and develop differently due to many variables, including their environment. For example, people in the Middle East were practicing agriculture 10,000 years ago, whereas Native American societies in the southeastern North America did not rely significantly on agriculture until about 1,000 years ago, and before that were very successful using their local environments without having to grow a lot of crops. They were able to use the environment to hunt and gather food, and made a very nice living for themselves, and developed some pretty advanced cultures and societies without the use of agriculture in many cases. This is a general timeline of the eastern U.S., the prehistoric chronology and I want to kind of introduce some terms you may not have heard before, but these are very common terms when we were talking about prehistoric cultures in the eastern part of North America. On the left-hand side, we kind of start off with the Paleo-Indian period, which Paulette mentioned earlier. That's the earliest known period where human beings come into the picture. And the timeline, the time for the arrival of Paleo-Indians in this part of the world has been shifting backwards in time on a pretty regular basis. At the current time, we have pretty good evidence of the arrival of the Native Americans in this part of the world between 13,000 and 16,000 years ago. And I just wanted to say, when we use the term prehistory, not to say that the people didn't have history before written records came about. It's just, I think Paulette mentioned, when we say prehistory, we simply mean before there was written records that we have a way of reading. Again, the Paleo-Indian, the earliest time the earliest culture that we've identified humans as being in this part of the world. And after a period of time, there's some changes in the climate. There's some changes in the material culture that we see in the archaeological context, and that from the Paleo-Indian transitioned into what archaeologists refer to as the Archaic period, and that's divided up into phases. I'll talk a little bit more about that. But you see the broad time scale. The Archaic is the longest time period in the human occupation of this part of the world. Starts at roughly 9,500 years ago and ends approximately 2,500 years ago. And I'll go into the BP and those abbreviations in a minute. Following the Archaic period, we have what's typically called the woodland. Woodland is a kind of a catch-all term for many different regional cultures, mainly defined by factors such as pottery. Fired clay pottery is in the picture at this point, and there's many regional variations, and those regional variations in pottery are equated with cultures, different societies, different groups. We'll go into a little bit more detail about that. And after the woodland period is the Mississippian. The Mississippian, that term comes from when archaeologists were studying Native American earthworks. There's a large concentration of mounds and earthworks in the Mississippi Valley and the Ohio Valley, and many other of the large drainages of the Midwest, and also to a lesser degree in the southeastern U.S. But this time period is subsumed under the catch-all Mississippian, which refers to the major mound building cultures of the later prehistoric time. And finally, we get the arrival of Europeans who start writing things down and leaving records of the Native American cultures that they encountered. And that brings us into the roughly what we call the modern period, or the period after the arrival of European colonizers who began making extensive written records of the cultures they encountered that were already here. And the region we're looking at is primarily what we call the Eastern Woodlands. That's where the woodland culture got its name from. Is these culture types are mainly restricted to the eastern part of the country, which was basically covered in a huge forest when Europeans first arrived. It includes most of the East Coast and all the way to the Mississippi River, and also including parts of southern Canada. But anyway, that's where the woodland period got its name from, was this part of the continent that those cultures are primarily representative. And these are where most of the mound building took place in this region. It does spread westward somewhat also into Oklahoma, but it really starts to taper off as you go west of the green area. And we started talking some about dates, and I'll quickly detail some of you'll see some of these dates if you read archaeological reports. Different terminologies are used, and it can be confusing, so I'll just quickly cover those. In some cases, you'll see BCE, and that can be abbreviated as some people say before the Common Era or before the Christian Era. But before the Common Era is probably the more common. And that goes back to the start of the Gregorian or the Julian calendar, which starts around in the year. What they determined, those calendar makers determined, was the year 0 or the year 1, and currently the calendar we use today. CE is another commonly used term, or Common Era. And when you start getting into the deeper time scales, like 10, 15,000 years ago, you'll see the term BP used commonly before the present, and the present being 1950 for the purposes of this. And I'll go into why that is when we talk about carbon-14 dating. Again, you'll see BC pretty frequently, and AD. Those are probably what we're most familiar with when we're talking about long, far back time scales. So roughly, when we say 500 BC, that's roughly 2,500 years ago. Okay. Some other terms you might see is RCYBP, or radiocarbon years before the present. And in this case, when you're talking radiocarbon, the present is determined to be 1950, which is that was the date when the above ground nuclear testing actually put a lot of contamination into the carbon record. So pretty much a lot of the carbon samples that you would see after this date are going to be skewed by the amount of radioactivity that was put in the air during above ground nuclear testing. Another term you might see is YA, or simply years ago. And in some cases, you'll actually see KA for thousands of years ago. You won't see that much in the archaeology of this part of the world, because human time scales don't go back very far enough to really make that term useful. So you won't see KA very often, but it is out there. Okay, and Paulette again mentioned earlier, there's absolute dating, there's relative dating. And again, we've got our time scale with the Paleo-Indian, the Archaic, the Mississippi, the Woodland, the Mississippian, and the contact period. But how do we set archaeological sites against this time scale? How do we know what a site makes a site archaic or what makes a site Mississippian? Well, before carbon-14 dating came in, archaeologists had to use relative dating, and that relates to the law of superposition or the law of stratigraphy. And it's pretty simple. It simply means that in an undisturbed stratigraphic sequence, the oldest strata will be at the bottom. Pretty obvious, pretty simple. And this is what we use to determine chronological sequences. So you find artifacts that are at a strata lower than the ones above it. So you can relatively date those artifacts. The ones higher up in the strata are more recently laid down. However, that does not tell us how old something is, only which layer was laid down earliest, and therefore which artifacts were deposited earliest. So until the 1950s, with the advent of radiocarbon dating, we didn't have any really way of determining how old archaeological sites were for sure. There were some pretty good guesses, and a lot of those earlier guesses turned out to be pretty close in some cases. But radiocarbon really was a big game changer. So we talk about the law of superposition. Here is a kind of an idealized archaeological site with the strata nicely laid out. You see the dark layers with artifacts in them representing occupation periods, and the sandy, sterile layers representing periods when the site wasn't being used. And up at the top, you can kind of see that if you can see my cursor, there's a kind of looks like a pit of some kind. Somebody dug a pit and some artifacts got thrown into it. So you can see how the stratigraphic record can be somewhat convoluted. You might see it looks like maybe an animal burrow off on the right-hand side. So an animal dug down through, and then the fill in the upper levels fill down into that. So that's just the kind of the thing that makes the stratigraphic record be interesting and also complicated. So you'll see some of the artifacts that are at the bottom of the pit are actually were more recently deposited than the layer the pit intrudes through. And that's just kind of an idealized example of why it's important that when archaeological sites are undisturbed, you can get a lot of information. But if the site gets disturbed, either accidentally or on purpose, then a lot of the value of the archaeology is lost when the site is all mixed up, and you really can't get any good information. And again, absolute dating, carbon-14 dating, or radiocarbon assay is a relatively recent development. It was developed in the 1950s by a scientist called Willard Libby. And Willard actually won the Nobel Prize, the 1960 Nobel Prize for this discovery. And carbon-14 dating is based on the measurable decay of the radioactive isotope of carbon-14, which is present in all organic material. All living organisms have carbon-14 present. But when we die, the carbon-14 begins to decay and stabilize, and that can be measured. So you can get a sample of bone or wood, burned wood out of an archaeological site, run it through the carbon-14 dating process, and you get an idea of how old that artifact was or that item was when it basically died, or when it started to decay. Carbon-14 isotope started to decay. And unfortunately, there's about a 50,000 year time limit on radiocarbon dating. So artifacts or archaeological sites that are older than 50,000 years cannot effectively be dated using carbon-14 dating. But in this part of the world, in North America, we don't have any reliable evidence of archaeological sites that are older than that even were even close to 50,000 years. So carbon-14 dating is still a very useful tool when determining the age of an archaeological site. Again, just to kind of reemphasize, relative dating is the oldest material. The oldest material is on the bottom, and successful strata above that, or progressively more recent. But with absolute dating, we can take samples. If there's organic material that's suitable for carbon-14 dating, we can take samples and then get actual dates back to see how those that strata lines up as far as actual age dating. You can see that in this hypothetical case, you indeed have samples from the earliest layers are dating older, and you'll see the plus and minus. That is standard when you get a carbon-14 dating. It's carbon-14 dating is unable to provide a precise date, but it gives you a small range. It gives you a plus and minus. Kind of going back to the Paleo-Indian period, the earliest period, we're looking at somewhere between 12,000 and 15,000 years ago, roughly. Kind of the characteristics of the human society at this time was, we believe it was highly mobile. We don't see a lot of major archaeological sites that indicate there were large settlements at this time period. So the assumption is that they were highly mobile, that there weren't a lot of people at that time. They were still exploring the landscape and moving around on a fairly regular basis, exploring the environment. Their diet, what they were eating, does seem to have included some aspects of the megafauna, or the large mammals that lived at that time, including the mastodon. You do see evidence of human interaction with these animals. There are archaeological sites that have bones with cut marks on them. There's a spear point, a famous artifact. There's a spear point embedded in the skull of a bison, of an extinct bison. We don't think their society had a lot of stratification. If you're looking at a band level society, there's just not a lot of, you don't have kings and high status individuals very much at that time. So strata, the society probably fairly flat. And most of the site types from this time period are either isolated projectile points, some artifact scatters. Stratified habitation sites are exceedingly rare, and they're almost always near a water source. You'll see a lot of the rivers in Northwest Florida have a lot of Paleo-Indian sites. At the time period, there wasn't a lot of water, and I'll talk about the environment in a second. But there wasn't a lot of surface water at the time, so a lot of the evidence of the Paleo-Indians come from rivers and springs. And we don't know much about their burial practices. There's very, very little human remains from this time period. So this is what Florida would have looked like, the southeastern North America would have looked like at the time of the Paleo-Indian first arrival, around 15,000 years ago. The sea levels were a lot lower. The climate was much colder and drier. A lot of the fresh water was locked up at the poles in these big ice sheets. So the sea level was much lower. The land mass of Florida was much larger. Here's the outline of current Florida, roughly. So you see there was, at the time the Paleo-Indians were here, there was a lot more land surface that could have been used. And if the idea is, a lot of Paleo-Indian sites have probably now been inundated and are out in the Gulf. But there was a lot more territory for that population to exploit So a lot of the earlier sites may have been farther out on the continental shelf that is now under a couple hundred feet of water. Here's a couple of examples of what the artifacts look like from that time period. They're these large or fairly large lancet points, very distinctive. Following the Archaic, we have following the Paleo-Indian, we have the Archaic period I mentioned earlier. It was divided up into phases. The early Archaic, immediately, this transition period between the Paleo-Indian and the Archaic period, in reality, the characteristics of the early Archaic are very similar in ways to the Paleo-Indian, with the exception that at this point, the megafauna is no longer in the picture. We're not, at this time, we don't see any more of the mastodon and the bison, and these animals are no longer part of their environment. The diet is much broader, and we still think possibly there's still a great deal of mobility to the societies. We still don't see large early archaic sites. However, there's a couple of really interesting exceptions that I'll take a minute to talk about. One is the Wendover site in Brevard County, and the other is there's the Little Salt Spring site, and also the offshore Sarasota site, which is a fairly recent discovery, and I'll talk a bit more about that. But those are examples of how the early archaic population may not have been as mobile as we thought it was. Moving into the middle archaic, still thinking there's some seasonal mobility going on, although more limited than before. This time period is when we start to see an increasing reliance on aquatic resources, shellfish on the coast. As the sea level is rising at this time period, the environment is changing. The estuarine systems that we know today are starting to become established as the sea level rises. So as the shellfish like oysters start to become more common, humans start to exploit them. And the large coastal shell middens and the interior river shell middens start to become established. And finally, the late archaic. This time period is characterized by the introduction of fired clay pottery, which is a hallmark of this period. It kind of signals the end of the archaic period and shifting into the woodland. About 4,200 years ago, we start to see fired clay pottery with fiber tempered. And if we were doing this in person, we'd be handing around some really good examples of fired clay pottery with fiber tempering. It's very distinctive. We start to see the use of canoes. There's canoes that date from this time period that have been found. So we know that they were using them for transportation and for resource exploitation. And we do see burials in shell middens. They are shell rings, or a kind of an interesting late archaic development. Mounds and shell rings along the coast are a really interesting phenomenon. And I will talk about the Wendover site as a really interesting site from the early archaic period. This site was found in Brevard County. It dates to about 7,400 years before the present. And the really interesting part is that there was a lot of fabric and cordage. This is woven fabric that is a really high quality woven fabric. So the technology to do weaving was present at that time. And also, just briefly, I'll mention there's a mitochondrial DNA was extracted from preserved brain matter from individuals that were buried here, and that pretty much tied in the that this population is genetically related to modern Native Americans. It also gave us some interesting information about their mortuary patterns, how they handled the dead. In this case, this site, the burials were flexed, which means the individuals were in a kind of a fetal position. And in some cases, there were bundles of bones and the really interesting part is they were placed underwater. They were kind of covered up with fabric and tied down with stakes. And the social stratification seems to have been minimal because the burial population at this site included adults, young people, men, women. So it doesn't look like they were segregating individuals by gender or by age. Everybody seems to have been buried relatively in the same conditions. Just quickly, this map illustrates the early archaic known sites. The little green dots are early archaic sites. You can see the distribution over the landscape. The Wendover site is in the red box at the right. The offshore Sarasota site is in the red box at the lower left. And so you can see the two sites are on opposite coasts. So this and at the offshore Sarasota site, the conditions that the burials were found in, the human remains, were comparable to the Wendover site in the same kind of bundle situation. So there's basically a lot of similarities between these two geographically quite separate sites. So pretty interesting. Again, we think that the diet they were exploiting a lot of different environments for their diet. They were hunting, they were gathering, possibly some limited use of plant. I mean, there's definitely use of plants, we know that, but whether they were simply being collected from the environment or they were actively being cultivated, that's still a subject of debate. Again, you can kind of see the difference between there's the early archaic site distribution to the middle archaic. There's a lot more sites. Some of this is going to be survey bias. We haven't evenly surveyed everywhere for sites. You can see there's clusters. Those clusters are, to a certain degree, a factor of survey bias. But there are definitely more middle archaic sites on the landscape that we found than early archaic. And this has been interpreted as an increase of the population. So there's more people, there's more sites being produced. People are going into different parts of the state and exploiting different environments. There's definitely an increasing reliance on the aquatic resources, such as shellfish. And part of that is due to the changing environment, which has allowed these coastal ecosystems that favor shellfish to come up and to be available for exploitation. And finally, the late archaic, this is when the fired clay pottery comes into the picture. So there's a lot more sites that we've identified, and the fired clay pottery is a very strong indicator, and that's probably maybe giving us a view that there are more late archaic sites than early archaic sites because of the fact that pottery is so characteristic and so easily identifiable. But there's a lot of similarities between the early archaic, or the middle archaic, and the late archaic. It's just now you have the fired clay pottery, which is a very clear indicator. Okay. Now I will shift, and again, I kind of broke it down into regions now. If we were in Southwest Florida, I might talk more about the Caloosahatchee or the South Florida cultures, but we're going to pretend we're in Northwest Florida this time. And so this diagram, you see the state's divided up into a number of areas. And these areas are primarily defined by pottery types that are found in those areas. So we're going to pretend we're in the Northwest region today. So this part of the state is just referred to as the Northwest. And just to be clear, we are we transitioned out of the archaic. We're in the woodland now. There's a definite, because of all the different pottery types distributed throughout the state, they're concentrated in certain areas. Certain types are concentrated in certain areas. In the northwest part of Florida, we're primarily seeing certain pottery types that I'll talk a little bit about. But the woodland period is characterized by an increasing regionalization. You see all the different regions that we can identify now based on pottery types. The economy differs from one area to the next, but there's still a lot of everybody's fishing, everybody's hunting, almost everybody's collecting shellfish to one degree or another, either at the coast or in interior rivers. At this time, you'll see low sand burial mounds become extremely common. Pretty much a very common way of interring the dead. In some parts of mostly in North Florida, you will see what we would call agriculture or horticulture, where people are actively using plants to produce food sources. And social stratification starts to be identifiable based on the way individuals are treated. Mound burial of some individuals, there is the way the artifacts are included in burials of some individuals seem to indicate that certain individuals have a higher level of social position than others. But there's still village complexes are commonly associated with mounds or mountain complexes. But we're still seeing a lot of settlement is still taking place near permanent freshwater sources or along the coast. Again, kind of looking at mostly the northwestern part of Florida, enters the Deptford period after you come out of the Archaic with its fiber-tempered pottery. That transitions into referred to as Deptford pottery, which is more of a sand or grit tempered type of pottery. It's primarily concentrated in Florida along the west coast, the northwest and the northwest coast. Also stretches up into northeast Florida a little bit and coastal Georgia and South Carolina. This is sand tempered pottery as opposed to fiber tempered pottery. There's a lot more sites from this time period. Deptford period sites are pretty common, mostly adjacent to the coast. We don't know a whole lot about the Deptford culture in the interior. Seems to be a lot of marine orientation. Again, I say a lot of Deptford sites are along the coast, and you'll see a lot of fish and shellfish use at those sites. Okay, kind of transitioning out of the Deptford period, you will see a new type of pottery appear, referred to as Swift Creek, or in some cases Santa Rosa Swift Creek in the extreme western panhandle. I think here's an example of Swift Creek pottery. It's pretty distinctive. It's a lot of the more elaborate pottery is paddle stamped, whereas the clay was wet and was stamped by carved wooden paddles. And if we were in person, we'd be showing you some really interesting examples of this pottery. But this type of pottery is largely concentrated along the northwest, in the northwest part of the state. And there's the Swift Creek. Kind of transitioning out of the Swift Creek, you've got the Weeden Island period, roughly 8,300 to 900. Again, primarily defined by pottery types. There are regional variations in this pottery type, which archaeologists interpret to correlate to different cultures. The idea is that pottery making is a very traditional. You don't see a lot of innovation in short periods of time. So there's a lot of tradition that goes into pottery making. People would tend to make the same kind of pottery over long periods of time. And as those pottery types transition, you'll see certain types will fall out of favor and other types will come into favor. So you'll see a transition from one type to another, and that's what happens. In this case, the Swift Creek transitions out of that and into the Weeden Island. And again, the pottery types are really what is illustrating this. And transitioning out of and that was all woodland. It's referred to as woodland cultures or woodland period. We're transitioning to the Mississippian period along the northwest coast. Is primarily referred to as the Fort Walton period. After transitioning out of the Weeden Island, you still see there's a lot of interior settlement, more so than the woodland period. Mound burials, middens, and villages become much bigger. There's a couple of really important ceremonial complexes. One is at Lake Jackson Mounds in Tallahassee, and these types of large mound complexes really become very common in the Mississippian period, not just in Florida, but all over. Again, the Mississippi Valley, the Ohio River Valley, major drainages like that, you'll see these large mound complexes start to become very common. And this is where we think the social organization becomes much more stratified. And based on accounts of early European explorers, there was a definite chiefdom level organization to societies at these large mound complexes. And this is also where intensive agriculture is very well established at this point in the Southeast, and also parts of the Midwest and Upper Midwest. Some of these major mound complexes have platform mounds, sand mounds, and shell mounds. Burials are taking place in villages and in mounds. And essentially, the Mississippian period, these cultures had become pretty serious architects and engineers. They've started digging. There's canals that were dug, major mound complexes with large villages. So they were really developing an advanced, socially advanced culture. And this is about the time that European explorers arrived and really started. Made a lot of observations about the cultures in the Southeast. And this is just a couple of posters that were from a few years ago for Archaeology Month. Engineers at the Mississippian. There's some pretty remarkable mound building and canal building were taking place. You can kind of see the Pineland site in the upper right-hand corner, which is on the southwest coast. They had canals and mound complexes that were very sophisticated. And finally, the kind of wrapping up the contact period, when Europeans arrived, starting with chroniclers, they observed A definite chiefdom organization was very common in this part of Northwest Florida. When the Spanish arrived, there was the Appalachian culture. They had a very defined chiefdom organization, a stratified society. They were practicing agriculture. And they start to become influenced by the Europeans that arrived. And this was the beginning of the effort, the beginning of with the Spanish missionaries. The missionization effort started in this time period. Sight to see a lot of villages are very common, mounds are very common, and in some cases, mounds have been found with European trade goods. And I'll just briefly talk about the groups that were described when the Europeans arrived in this part of Florida. Again, in the Tallahassee area, the Appalachian chiefdom was present. Farther west, the Pensacola, the Apalachicola. Up in Georgia and Alabama, not too far away, the Miccosukee, and what's commonly referred to as the Creek. And you can see farther down in South Florida, the Calusa were a very well-known chiefdom organization. And in Northeast Florida, you can kind of see some of the smaller regional cultures. The Timucua was a large language group that incorporated many different groups. The Timucua, you probably heard of the Timucua. They weren't really a society per se. They were really Timucua was really a language group that incorporated a lot of cultures that spoke a common language. Most of North Florida were practicing an intensive, we call it intensive harvest economy, and growing a lot of crops. The Timucua and the Appalachia were well documented by the Spanish as having a lot of agriculture. And I'll just kind of finish up by mentioning that today there's two federally recognized tribes in the state of Florida, the Seminole and the Miccosukee. Culturally, the roots are in the Muskogee peoples of the Creek peoples from Georgia and Alabama. However, the Seminole and the Miccosukee, when the groups that were here, when the Spanish arrived, when the Seminole and the Miccosukee moved down into Florida, based on the population decrease from disease and warfare brought on by the Spanish and the warfare, the colonial, the battles between colonial powers that were going on. When the Creek started moving into Florida, into Spanish Florida, and they assimilated a lot of the groups that were still here. And so the Seminole and the Miccosukee represent the native groups that were here when the Spanish arrived, and they're all really part of the same, genetically part of the same population. Okay. And again, this is a lot of the groups that were described when the Spanish arrived. You had the Timucua and the Wally up in the Northeast coast, the Appalachia in kind of the central panhandle area. Down in the Southwest coast, the Calusa, the Tocobaga. In Southeast Florida, the Tequesta, the Matacumbe, and the Keys. These are just some of the more well-known groups that you may have heard of before. Now you'll see that poster was titled "The Lost Tribes," but in fact they were not lost. That term has transitioned to what you used to call the Trail of Florida's Lost Tribes is now the Trail of Florida's Indian Heritage, because some Native Americans pointed out, hey, we're not lost, we're still here. Okay, I think that again, just the two federally recognized tribes, and that concludes my presentation.
so much, Bill.
Oh, let me see if I can.
All right, so we're going to take a break. Let's do